Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today on something you might not expect, the impact of recreational walking on the environment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're looking closely at Chapter 2 from this academic book about managing recreational walking. And honestly, you might be surprised at how much our hikes and walks can actually affect nature.
Hmm.
I mean, we're talking vegetation, soil, wildlife, even water quality.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to give you a taste of some of the interesting stuff we'll be talking about, did you know that there's a mountain in Ireland where 30,000 people climb it on a single day?
Wow.
Or that scientists actually measure how many footsteps it takes to kill certain plants?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we'll cover all that and more, so let's get started.
You know, it's funny because we often think of walking as like this super eco-friendly activity.
Right. Yeah.
It's a way to connect with nature without leaving much of a footprint. But the truth is, even those seemingly light steps can have some pretty big consequences.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the details, let's make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about recreational walking, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, it's really a broad spectrum. We're talking everything from a casual, like, weekend hike in your local park to those, epic multi-day backpacking trips you see on Instagram.
Right.
And let's not forget about those incredible devotional trails with deep cultural and historical significance.
Oh, yeah. Like those pilgrimages you mentioned.
Exactly.
Like the El Camino de Santiago in Spain, hundreds of thousands of people walking that every year. Or those iconic U.S. national trails, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail. Some people spend months through hiking those.
Yeah.
And then you have those unique traditions like the mountain in Ireland.
Yeah.
Croagh Patrick is it, with 30,000 people climbing it on one day.
Exactly. Croagh Patrick is a great example.
Wow.
That takes place on Reek Sunday. And it's fascinating to see how a tradition like that impacts the mountain environment. And thinking about the growing popularity of these activities kind of makes you wonder, can those beautiful trails and landscapes really handle all those footsteps?
That's a great question. And that's where things start to get really interesting. The book makes a distinction between formal trails and informal trails. Formal trails, I'm guessing, are the well-maintained ones, officially designated and managed.
Yeah.
And informal trails are more like desire paths, right?
Right.
The ones that pop up because people decide to cut across the grass instead of sticking to the paved walkway.
You got it.
Yeah.
Formal trails are planned and maintained by organizations like park services or hiking clubs, while those informal trails just kind of emerge organically, often because people stray from the beaten path, sometimes with good intentions, sometimes not. And those informal trails, unfortunately, are often the ones that cause the most damage.
Is that because they're not built to handle foot traffic?
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Think about Cadillac Mountain in Maine.
Okay.
It has this well-maintained network of formal trails, but despite that, hikers have created over 335 informal trails,
Wow.
creating a spider web of damage across this really fragile summit ecosystem.
Wow, 335 extra trails.
Yeah.
You can really picture how that would impact the environment.
Right.
And that's just one mountain.
Right.
Imagine that multiplied across all the popular hiking spots.
It really highlights the impact of the growing popularity of walking. Since the 1970s, we've seen this huge surge in people hitting the trails, both in the U.S. and the U.K.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's into hiking and walking these days. Are there any stats in the book about that?
There are. In the U.S., between 1982 and 2009, the number of people hiking shot up by a whopping 165%.
Wow.
And walking for pleasure saw an 84% increase. That's a huge jump. So you can imagine with more people on the trails, there's a growing concern about the environmental consequences.
Okay, so we've got a lot more people out walking, but how does that translate into actual impact? What kind of damage are we talking about?
Well, let's start with the most obvious.
Okay.
The plants. Even light foot traffic. Those seemingly harmless footsteps can bruise plants, break stems, and just generally make the vegetation shorter. It might not seem like much, but all those footsteps add up.
That makes sense. I guess it's kind of like repeatedly bending a blade of grass. Eventually it's going to break or weaken. But does trampling actually kill plants?
It can, especially with heavier use. Eventually you start to see bare patches where only the toughest, most resilient plants survive. The book compares it to a survival of the fittest scenario for plants where those that can't handle the pressure simply get edged out.
So we're literally weeding out the less resilient species just by walking on them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book dives into some really fascinating examples of how specific plants are affected by trampling.
Okay.
Did you know there's a type of grass called crested dog's tail? that has been shown to have 50% shorter stems along well-trodden paths.
Wow, 50%.
That's a huge difference.
That's pretty dramatic.
And it's not just the stem length. Trampling can affect all sorts of things. The size of seed pods, the length of seed heads and leaves, even the timing of flowering can be altered. The book mentions that ladies' bedstraw and wall speedwell, for example, start flowering earlier when they're subjected to heavier foot traffic. It's incredible how sensitive plants are to our presence, isn't it?
That's amazing. So are there any plants that actually thrive in these conditions? You know, the tough guys of the trail?
Oh, absolutely. The book actually has a whole table listing the more resilient species. Common bent grass-crested dog's tail grass, ryegrass, white clover. These are the champions of the trail side, the ones you often find dominating those well-worn paths.
Yeah.
It's like they've adapted to thrive in those trampled conditions.
That's interesting. So while trampling might be bad news for some plants, it actually gives others a competitive edge. But what about the soil itself? What's going on beneath our feet?
The soil. Well, it's more complex than you might think.
Yeah.
Initially, trampling actually leads to an increase in organic matter in the soil. That's because of all the broken down plant material.
So that sounds like a good thing, right? More organic matter means healthier soil.
Not so fast.
Oh.
It's not as straightforward as that. While you get that initial boost in organic matter, the real issue is soil compaction. As we literally compress the soil, squeezing out all the air pockets and making it denser. Imagine turning a light, fluffy cake into a dense, hard brick.
Right.
That's kind of what's happening to the soil.
Okay, I get the visual, but what does that actually do to the soil? Why is it a problem?
Well, that compaction has a lot of knock-on effects.
Yeah.
It reduces the soil's permeability, which means it's harder for water and air to get through.
Right.
Roots struggle to grow new seedlings, have a harder time germinating, and instead of soaking in rainwater, tends to run off the surface.
So we're basically choking the life out of the soil.
Yeah. In a way, yes. And here's the really concerning part. Unlike plants, which can often bounce back from damaged soil erosion, doesn't just naturally fix itself over time. Once it's gone, it's gone. The book talks about a study in Swiss woodlands where trampling caused an 80% decrease in water infiltration.
Wow, 80%.
That's a lot of water that's no longer soaking into the ground.
That's a scary thought. And if all that water is running off the surface, where's it going? What happens to it?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? All that runoff has to go somewhere. And it often ends up carrying soil particles into nearby streams, rivers, and lakes. And that leads to something called sedimentation, which basically means those water bodies get all clogged up with dirt and debris.
Right.
And that could be really bad news for the aquatic ecosystems that depend on those waterways.
Right, because it makes the water murky and all those little critters can't survive in those conditions.
Yeah.
This is not just about the trails themselves. It's about how those trails can impact the surrounding environment.
Precisely. The book highlights a bunch of studies that have found a direct link between increased human and animal traffic and higher levels of harmful bacteria in water sources.
Right.
For example, one study in the Sierra Nevada found that backcountry sites with pack animal traffic were way more likely to have high levels of coliform bacteria. And it's not just in remote areas. A similar study in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park found elevated levels of E. coli and other coliform bacteria in water sources near those popular Appalachian trail shelters.
E. coli. That's not something you want in your drinking water. So even if we're being super careful about our own waste, we could still be contributing to water contamination just by walking on those trails.
Yeah.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
It is, and it underscores the importance of responsible trail management and hiker education. We'll get into some of those management strategies later, but for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact on wildlife.
Okay.
We've covered plants and soil, but what about the animals that call these places home? How does all this foot traffic affect them?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. It's got to be disruptive to have all these humans tromping through their habitat.
Absolutely. You can imagine our presence on trails can be pretty disturbing to wildlife. For some animals, it means avoiding those areas altogether.
That makes sense. If I were a deer or a squirrel, I wouldn't want a bunch of noisy hikers crashing through my living room.
Exactly. And it's not just the noise. Those trails can also fragment their habitat.
Right.
It's like we're slicing and dicing their living space, making it harder for them to move around and find food and connect with other animals.
So it's like we're creating these barriers that make their world smaller and more difficult to navigate. But you know what's interesting? I've also heard that trails can actually attract certain types of animals.
That's true.
Yeah.
Sometimes our presence can actually be attractive to wildlife.
Yeah.
Either intentionally or unintentionally.
Like bears hoping for handouts.
Yeah, you mentioned bears hoping for handouts, and that's definitely a concern in some areas. But it can be more subtle than that. For instance, some birds are attracted to the insects that gather around those disturbed areas along trail sides.
So while we might be pushing some animals away, we're inadvertently luring others in. It's a pretty complex dynamic.
It is, and the book dives specifically into the impact on birds, particularly those that nest on the ground.
Okay.
They're especially vulnerable to disturbance because their nests are often hidden among the vegetation.
Right.
You might not even see them until it's too late.
Right, so even if we're trying to be careful, we could be walking right past a nest without realizing it.
Exactly. And when these birds are disturbed, they often flush from their nests, which leaves their eggs or chicks exposed to predators and the elements. It's a double whammy of danger for those little ones.
It's like a chain reaction of negative impacts. We scare the parent bird away, and then its offspring are left vulnerable.
And each time a bird flushes, that's burning precious energy that it could be using for foraging or caring for its young.
Right.
So it's not just about immediate threats. It's about the cumulative stress we're putting on these animals.
Right, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
So are there any ways to minimize that disturbance, or is it just an unavoidable consequence of sharing these spaces with wildlife?
Well, the book points to a study on golden plovers in the UK that offers a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
These birds were breeding near a popular long-distance footpath called the Pennine Way. Before the trail was resurfaced, the plovers were avoiding areas within 200 meters of the path, presumably because so many hikers were straying off trail and disturbing them.
Right.
It was like they had created this invisible buffer zone around the trail.
So they were literally being pushed out of their preferred habitat. But what happened after the trail was resurfaced?
That's where things get interesting. After the resurfacing, and with most hikers now staying on the designated path, the plover's avoidance zone shrunk to just 50 meters.
Wow.
It suggests that if we can keep our impact contained, we can minimize that disturbance to wildlife.
So it's really all about staying on the trail.
Exactly.
It sounds so simple, but it can actually make a big difference for these birds.
Exactly. And here's another encouraging finding from that study.
Okay.
Despite their behavioral response to hikers, there was no measurable negative impact on the plover's breeding success. It highlights the fact that some birds are more adaptable than others, and that even within a species, impacts can vary greatly.
That's a good point. We tend to lump all wildlife together, but different species have different tolerances and adaptations.
Exactly. The book also mentions other studies that have found similar results. Some species seem to coexist just fine with humans on trails.
Okay.
There was one study on nesting cardinals that found no link between nest survival and how easily the birds flushed when hikers were present. Another study found that the abundance of red squirrels near trails didn't differ significantly from control sites.
So it's not all doom and gloom for wildlife. Some species are more resilient and adaptable than others, but it sounds like the key is to be aware of those potential impacts and to manage our activities accordingly.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about finding that balance between our desire to enjoy nature and the need to protect it.
Right.
And sometimes that means making tough choices, like limiting access to certain areas, closing trails during sensitive times, or even rerouting trails to avoid critical habitat.
Right. It's about taking responsibility for our impact and making sure we're not loving these places to death.
Speaking of taking responsibility, I'm fascinated by all those restoration techniques they used in the Three Peaks project.
Yes.
It sounds like they went to great lengths to bring those damaged trails back to life.
They did. And they learned a lot along the way.
Yeah.
One of the most effective techniques they used, especially on those steep slopes where an aggregate path wasn't feasible, was something called stone pitching.
Okay.
Imagine building a staircase out of rocks. That's essentially what they did.
I can picture that, carefully placing each stone to create a durable and natural-looking surface. It sounds very labor-intensive.
It was. But they faced some challenges along the way.
Initially, they didn't reinforce the stone pitching, and those stones ended up shifting and creating channels for water to flow through, which actually made the erosion worse.
Oh, wow. So their attempt to fix the problem actually backfired.
It did, but thankfully they were able to learn from that mistake.
Okay.
They eventually started reinforcing the stone pitching with a base layer of concrete, which proved to be much more effective.
It's good that they were willing to adapt and try new things. It sounds like there's a lot of trial and error involved in this kind of work.
Absolutely. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to experiment and refine your techniques based on what you learn.
So what about those really damaged areas, the ones that were beyond just fixing the surface? What did they do for those?
They tried a variety of approaches, but one that proved particularly effective, especially in terms of cost and speed, was something called mechanized path construction using subsoil.
Okay.
It involved using a large digger to remove the top layer of peat, which was basically dead and beyond repair, and then exposing the underlying mineral soil, which had more potential for recovery.
So it was like giving those trails a fresh start, a new foundation to build on.
Exactly. They created drainage ditches on either side of the path to channel water away, and then they surfaced it with crushed limestone.
Okay.
It was a pretty drastic approach,
Yeah.
but it was very effective in stabilizing the soil and preventing further erosion.
It's amazing what they were able to accomplish with a bit of ingenuity and some heavy machinery. But it wasn't just about rebuilding the trails themselves. It was also about restoring the surrounding ecosystem, right?
Absolutely. They had a whole ecological component to the project, focusing on bringing those damaged areas back to life.
Mm.
They experimented with a bunch of techniques, including seeding transplanting, and even using those erosion control blankets I mentioned earlier.
The erosion control blankets, those are the ones that are like giant bandages for the landscape, right?
That's the one. They're basically these thin layers of material that are preceded with a mix of grasses and other plants. They help to prevent erosion and give those seeds a head start.
It's like giving those bare patches a little TLC, helping them heal and recover.
Exactly. And they used hydroseeding as well,
Okay.
which is where they spray a mix of seeds, fertilizer, and soil onto the ground. That was especially effective in quickly establishing a ground cover on those large bare areas.
It sounds like a pretty efficient way to revegetate those damaged zones. But I imagine it's not as simple as just throwing down some seeds and hoping for the best.
You're right, it's definitely more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
They had to be really strategic considering things like the soil type moisture levels and sunlight exposure.
Yeah.
It's not about planting anything, it's about choosing the right plants for the right place.
So matching the plant to the environment, that makes sense. But I'm curious, what were their overall goals with these ecological restoration efforts? Were they trying to recreate those original plant communities exactly as they were before the damage?
That was their initial thought.
Okay.
To sort of rewind the clock and bring back those pristine ecosystems.
Right.
But they quickly realized that was pretty much impossible, especially on a large scale.
Yeah.
The seeds for many of those native species were hard to come by,
Mm.
and the cost was just prohibitive.
So they had to adjust their expectations and come up with a more realistic plan.
Exactly. They shifted their focus to establishing a stable, self-sustaining plant community that would prevent further erosion and provide habitat for wildlife.
Right.
It wasn't about recreating the past. It was about setting the stage for a healthy future.
That's a really important point. Restoration isn't always about going back to some idealized version of the past. It's about creating the conditions for nature to heal and thrive in the present and future.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And that often involves embracing those tough-adaptable species, the ones that can handle a bit of disturbance.
Right.
They might not be the most glamorous, but they play a crucial role in stabilizing the soil and paving the way for a more diverse ecosystem down the line.
So it's about recognizing the value of those unsung heroes of the plant world. But speaking of unsung heroes, let's talk a bit more about the impact of recreational walking on water quality.
Sure.
We touched on this earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper dive.
I agree. As we discussed before, one of the biggest concerns is contamination from human and animal waste.
Right.
If hikers don't properly dispose of their waste, it can seep into water sources. And that can introduce harmful bacteria and pathogens into those delicate aquatic ecosystems.
And nobody wants to be drinking water that's contaminated with, well, poop.
Exactly. And it's not just about human waste. Pack animals can also contribute to the problem.
Right.
Their droppings contain high levels of bacteria, and if they're not properly managed, they can easily wash into streams and lakes.
So even if we're being super careful ourselves, those horses and mules could be leaving behind a less than desirable legacy.
Unfortunately, that's true. But the good news is that education can make a huge difference here. Hikers and pack animal users need to be aware of the potential for contamination and take steps to prevent it.
What kind of steps are we talking about?
For hikers, it's all about those leave no trace principles.
Okay.
That means properly disposing of human waste by digging cat holes at least 200 feet from water sources
Right.
and packing out used toilet paper.
Right, because even something as seemingly innocuous as toilet paper can have an impact on those fragile ecosystems.
Exactly. And for pack animal users, it's about managing their animals' waste responsibly.
Right.
That might involve packing out manure or at least scattering it away from water sources.
So it's about taking ownership of our actions and those of our animals. But, it's not just about waste contamination. It's also about how trampling can affect water quality, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how trampling can lead to soil erosion and sedimentation.
Right.
And all that soil that gets washed away
Yeah.
has to go somewhere, usually into those nearby water bodies.
Right. So it's like that muddy puddle effect we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But what does that actually do to the water?
Well, all those soil particles suspended in the water can reduce clarity, making it cloudy or murky.
Okay.
It's called turbidity. And it can have a whole cascade of negative effects on the aquatic ecosystem.
How so?
Well, for starters, it reduces the amount of sunlight that reaches aquatic plants, which can disrupt the entire food chain. It's like casting a shadow over that underwater world.
Right.
And all those suspended particles can clog the gills of fish and other aquatic organisms, making it hard for them to breathe.
So it's not just an aesthetic issue. It's a matter of survival for those creatures.
Exactly. And it can also affect the taste and odor of drinking water, making it less palatable for human consumption. So it's a problem that impacts both people and wildlife.
Wow. It really drives home the point that even seemingly insignificant actions can have far-reaching consequences.
It does. And it highlights the importance of managing trails and recreational activities in a way that minimizes erosion and sedimentation.
Right.
Protecting the land, the water, and all the creatures that depend on them.
It's all connected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book actually mentions a study that linked a 27% increase in channel changes, including bank erosion along the Merced River in Yosemite National Park, to heavy foot traffic.
So they're saying that hikers were actually contributing to the reshaping of that river?
That's what the research suggests.
Wow.
They found a correlation between areas with high visitor use and increased bank erosion. The theory is that all that trampling was damaging the riparian vegetation, those plants that grow along the riverbanks,
Right.
which play a crucial role in holding the soil together and preventing erosion.
Right. It's like those plants act as a natural buffer, protecting the riverbank from the force of the water.
Exactly. And when that vegetation is damaged or destroyed, the riverbank becomes more vulnerable to erosion, and the river channel starts to change.
So it's a domino effect. Our footsteps impact the plants, which impacts the soil, which impacts the river.
Yeah,
It really highlights how interconnected these ecosystems are.
it does. And it emphasizes the importance of managing those riparian areas.
Right.
They're incredibly valuable for maintaining water quality, providing habitat for wildlife, and regulating stream flow.
So it's not just about protecting the trails themselves, it's about protecting those crucial buffer zones along waterways.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that even seemingly insignificant actions like stepping on a plant or kicking up some dust can ripple outward and have far-reaching consequences.
It's about taking a more holistic view of our impact on the environment.
Exactly. And that requires a shift in mindset from seeing ourselves as separate from nature to recognizing that we're an integral part of it.
Right.
Our actions have the power to either harm or heal the natural world.
It's about choosing to be stewards rather than just consumers of those precious resources.
Well said. And speaking of stewardship, the book discusses a variety of techniques for managing the footpath surface itself,
Okay.
creating more resistant surfaces that can withstand the wear and tear of all those footsteps.
Yeah, we touched on some of those earlier, like stone pitching and aggregate paths, but I'd love to dive a bit deeper into those and learn about some other techniques they used.
Sure. There's a whole science to building sustainable trails.
Right.
And over the years, there have been tons of pioneering works and research done in the UK and the US to figure out the best practices for trail construction and maintenance. It's quite fascinating, actually.
So what are some of the key considerations when choosing a material or technique for a trail surface?
Well, just like when building a house, it's about choosing the right materials for the job.
Right.
And it's also about understanding the specific challenges of each site. Is it a steep slope? Is the soil loose and sandy? Is it prone to flooding? All these factors come into play.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. But let's talk about some commonly used techniques.
Okay.
We've already mentioned aggregate paths, which are basically those trails covered in crushed stone or gravel.
Yeah.
They're pretty effective at creating a durable surface.
Right. Kind of like those miniature gravel roads we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But it's not just about using any old rocks.
Okay.
The type of aggregate matters. Angular quarry-graded material is often preferred because it packs down nicely and resists erosion.
So the shape of the stones matters.
It does. Sometimes they use locally sourced materials like gravel from stream beds or borrow pits, which are basically areas where they dug up soil for another project.
Right.
But those materials can be less durable if they contain too much rounded gravel or clay.
So knowing the properties of your materials is crucial.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the material itself, it's about how it's installed.
Okay.
That's where borders come in.
Okay.
They're basically those raised edges you see along the sides of some trails, kind of like a frame.
Right. I've seen those. They help to contain the aggregate and keep it from spilling out.
Exactly. And they can be made from all sorts of materials, wood, stone, even recycled plastic.
Right.
They're a great way to keep the trail tidy and also provide a visual cue to hikers to stay on the path.
So it's a win-win better for the trail and helps with those pesky informal trails we talked about earlier. But what about those really sensitive areas like wetlands or bogs? You can't exactly put down gravel there.
That's where boardwalks come in. They're often used in those wetter, more delicate areas.
Yeah.
You've probably seen them before, those raised wooden pathways that help to keep your feet dry and minimize disturbance to the ground below.
Yeah, they're great. I've even seen some really fancy ones made from composite materials or recycled plastic.
Exactly. Boardwalks can be a great way to protect those fragile ecosystems, but they do require regular maintenance to make sure they're safe and don't deteriorate too quickly.
Makes sense. So it's not a set it and forget it solution.
Yeah.
Even those durable trails need a bit of TLC from time to time.
That's right. Trail maintenance is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
But let's talk about another interesting technique, surface netting.
Surface netting. I don't think I've heard of that one before. What is that?
It involves using a special type of open weave netting, often made from biodegradable materials like jute, to stabilize the soil and help vegetation get established. They basically roll it out over the trail surface and secure it with these long wire staples.
So it's like a giant mesh blanket for the trail.
That's a great way to put it. The open weave allows water and air to penetrate, while the netting itself holds the soil in place, preventing erosion. And as the netting decomposes, it adds organic matter to the soil, which helps to improve its structure and fertility.
Sounds like a pretty eco-friendly approach.
It is, and it can be very effective, especially in those areas where the soil is loose and sandy and prone to wind erosion.
So it's not just about protecting those trails from foot traffic, it's also about protecting them from the elements.
Exactly. Trail management involves considering all those factors that can impact those trails, both human and natural.
It's about taking a holistic approach to make sure those trails are sustainable for the long haul.
Precisely. And that brings us to another set of techniques that might surprise you, the use of chemical binders and surface glues.
Chemical binders and glues on trails. That sounds a bit intense. What's the purpose of those?
They're basically substances that are designed to improve the strength and stability of the soil.
Okay.
They're often used along with other techniques like seeding or hydroseeding
Right.
to help those new plants get established and prevent erosion.
So it's like adding a bit of glue to hold everything together, literally. Are there specific types of glues that are used for trails?
There are. And there are a bunch of different products out there, each with its own pros and cons.
What are some of the things they consider when choosing a binder or glue?
Well, cost is always a factor,
Right.
as is the method of application.
Okay.
Some products come in powder form, which is easy to apply to smaller areas, while others come as emulsions that need to be sprayed with special equipment.
Right.
And of course, it's essential to consider the potential environmental impacts. Some products are more toxic to plants than others. So choosing a product that's compatible with the desired vegetation is key.
So it's about finding that balance between effectiveness and environmental responsibility.
Exactly. The book actually mentions a study that compared the toxicity of a range of glues on both grasses
Okay.
and bryophytes,
Okay.
which are those mosses and liverworts you often see on trails.
Right.
And they found that some glues actually had a stimulating effect on the growth of certain species.
So it's possible those glues could actually benefit plant growth in some cases.
It seems so.
Wow.
But we need more research to understand the long-term effects of these products on those delicate soil ecosystems.
That makes sense. It's like with any new technology, we need to make sure we fully understand the potential consequences before we go using it willy-nilly.
Absolutely. And it underscores the importance of approaching trail management with a cautious and informed perspective.
Speaking of cautious and informed, what about that surface molding technique you mentioned earlier? What exactly does that involve?
It's a really interesting technique that focuses on shaping the surface of the trail to improve drainage and reduce erosion.
Okay.
Instead of creating a flat or uniformly sloped trail,
Right.
they create these horizontal ledges or grooves in the surface.
So it's about creating a more textured surface, almost like a natural staircase.
Exactly. And there are different ways to do it. Sometimes it's just a matter of cutting small grooves in the soil, while other times they create larger stepped terraces.
What are the benefits of creating that kind of textured surface?
Well, those ledges and grooves help to slow down water flow, which reduces erosion and allows more water to soak into the soil. And as a bonus, they can create all these little microhabitats for plants and insects, increasing biodiversity along the trail.
So it's about working with nature rather than against it.
Exactly. Surface molding can be a very effective technique, especially on slopes that are prone to erosion.
So it's about choosing the right technique for the specific terrain and challenges of each site.
Precisely. Trail management is all about adapting to the unique circumstances of each location.
And it's about continuously learning and evolving our techniques to make sure those trails are sustainable for the long term.
Well said. The Three Peaks Project is such a valuable case study because it shows how we can approach trail management and restoration in a holistic and responsible way.
It's inspiring to see what can be accomplished when we put our minds and resources towards healing those damaged landscapes.
Yeah.
And it's a powerful reminder that we have the power to create trails that are both enjoyable for humans and sustainable for the environment.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But speaking of the Three Peaks Project, they didn't just focus on physical trail work.
Right.
They also conducted a lot of research on those ecological restoration techniques we talked about earlier. They really went above and beyond to try to bring back those native plant communities.
That's so cool. What were some of their key findings? Did they have much success with those efforts?
They had some wins and some losses, as with any experiment.
Right.
One thing they learned early on was that simply applying fertilizer to existing vegetation wasn't enough to increase its resilience to trampling. Even with those extra nutrients, the constant pressure from foot traffic just overwhelmed those poor plants.
So it's not just about giving them a boost, it's about reducing the pressure on them in the first place.
Exactly. They even tried using synthetic materials to reinforce the turf.
Okay.
Kind of like embedding a layer of mesh within the soil to hold those plant roots in place. It was like giving those plants a built-in support system.
What a creative idea. Did it work?
The results were mixed. Some of those materials were just too expensive or tricky to install, and others didn't allow the native vegetation to grow through.
So back to the drawing board on that one. What about restoring those severely damaged peat soils? How did they approach that challenge?
They initially tried to recreate those original plant communities using seed mixtures of indigenous species.
Okay.
It was a very ambitious goal to essentially rewind the clock and bring back those pristine ecosystems.
It sounds like a really challenging task.
It was. They quickly realized it was impractical on a large scale. The seeds for many of those native species were hard to find and really expensive.
So they needed a more pragmatic solution, something that would be both effective and affordable.
Exactly. They shifted their focus to getting a stable ground cover established quickly, using those fast-growing species like perennial ryegrass.
Right.
It was a way to stabilize the soil and create a favorable environment for those more delicate native plants to eventually make a comeback on their own.
So it's like creating a nursery for those more sensitive species, giving them a safe space to get established.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And thankfully, this approach proved to be much more successful.
Okay.
They use hydroseeding to spray a mix of ryegrass seeds, fertilizer, and soil onto those bare peat areas. And within a month, they had a really impressive grass cover.
That's amazing. It sounds like they were really able to make a difference with those restoration efforts.
They were, and they learned a lot along the way about what works and what doesn't.
Right.
Their experience highlights the importance of being adaptable and willing to try new things when it comes to ecological restoration.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What worked in the Yorkshire Dales might not work somewhere else.
Exactly. Every site has its own unique challenges and opportunities, but their work provides some valuable insights that can be applied to other trails and landscapes.
Absolutely. And it's inspiring to see what can be accomplished when we combine science engineering and a genuine passion for the natural world.
I agree. But before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on one more fascinating concept from the book, the idea of chemical consolidation. Have you ever heard of that?
Chemical consolidation, that's a new one for me. What is that exactly?
It's a technique that involves using special chemicals to bind the soil particles together, essentially making it more solid and resistant to erosion. Kind of like turning loose sand into something more like sandstone.
Wow, that sounds pretty high-tech. Where do they use that technique?
They've used it in a variety of settings, including on trails and slopes that are particularly prone to erosion. One of the most interesting examples is the use of a product called solidry on those heavily eroded trails in the Three Peaks area.
So they were actually using chemicals to try to repair those trails.
They were. It was a pretty novel approach at the time.
Did it work?
Well, unfortunately, not as well as they had hoped. The solidry ended up creating this impermeable crust on the surface of the soil, which actually prevented water from soaking in and made the erosion problems even worse.
Oh, no. So it was another one of those cases where the solution actually backfired.
It was. But it's a good example of how important it is to carefully consider the potential consequences before implementing any new technique, especially when it involves using chemicals.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to approach these challenges with a healthy dose of caution and always be mindful of the potential impacts on the environment.
Couldn't agree more. But despite those setbacks, the Three Peaks project overall was a resounding success. They were able to restore those heavily eroded trails, improve the ecological health of the area, and create a more sustainable recreational experience for visitors.
It's a testament to the power of human ingenuity and collaboration.
It is, and it gives me hope that we can find solutions to these pressing environmental challenges if we're willing to work together and learn from our mistakes.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, pun intended. We've delved into the surprisingly significant impacts of recreational walking on the environment, from trampling effects on vegetation to the potential for soil erosion and water contamination.
And we've explored a wide range of management strategies and restoration techniques, from the simple act of staying on designated trails to the more complex use of geotextiles and chemical binders.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I feel like I have a much deeper appreciation for those trails beneath our feet.
Me too. And I hope our listeners feel the same way.
I'm sure they do. But before we sign off, I wanted to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. We've talked a lot about the impacts of recreational walking, but what about the potential benefits?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
While the book focused primarily on the challenges, it did acknowledge that trails can provide valuable access to remote areas, allowing people to experience and appreciate the beauty of nature.
Right. It's about opening up those natural wonders to people who might not otherwise have the opportunity to see them.
Exactly. And there's also the potential for educational opportunities. Trails can be designed to showcase interesting geological formations, diverse plant communities, and even historical landmarks.
So it's about turning those trails into living classrooms.
Precisely. And of course, there are all the health benefits associated with walking. It's a great way to get exercise, reduce stress, and improve overall well-being.
So it's not just about the environment, it's about the well-being of the people who use those trails.
Absolutely. The key is to find that delicate balance between providing access to these natural areas and protecting them from the impacts of our presence.
It's about finding that sweet spot where human recreation and environmental conservation can coexist harmoniously.
Well said, and I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of recreational walking. We hope you learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to be a little more mindful on your next outdoor adventure.
Remember, every step we take leaves a trace, so let's make those traces as light and thoughtful as possible.
Happy trails, everyone.